Okay, well this is probably a silly title, but I'll try to explain what I had in mind later. This is going to be a slightly strange talk for me because instead of showing a bunch of project work, I'm going to basically talk about my understanding of what it means to do research through design and my understanding of what I don't want it to be. And so it's going to be kind of descriptive and kind of normative, and we'll just have to see where it goes. So I will start by just going over a project that we did a few years ago to give you a taste for the kind of work we do in the studio. This is a device called the Prayer Companion that we built. It's a tabletop device. It's about yay high. And it shows, has text light display on the top that shows a constant stream of short bits of text that are drawn from a variety of sources, including 25 RSS news feeds from around the world, mixed with excerpts from social networking sites that talk about people's feelings at the time. And it's meant to give a kind of resource revealing the current concerns and worries of people around the world. We built the device for a group of cloistered nuns in the north of England who are Catholic nuns. I'll tell you a bit more about them later. And we built the Prayer Companion as a resource for their prayers of intercession on behalf of other people. We deployed the device into the monastery about 3 years ago and went through this kind of stage of their appreciation of the device. So on the introduction, they really admired it for fitting into the decor of the monastery and for seeming like it wouldn't annoy them too much. Then after living with it for a few weeks, they started to become a bit annoyed after all, a little bit tired of some of the social networking comments. We had some work to tune that with them, and then they really just accommodated into their everyday lives and have used it ever since for more than 3 years. And very importantly in that, they talk about it influencing their prayer life pretty much from the beginning and right through, continuously throughout. So this is a long-term relationship that they've developed with the device we built. They really like it. We really like the fact they like it. It's all good. So what have we done with this? Well, one of the key things we've done with this work is to publish it. We've written a description about it. As Yesha said, we published this in the to the Chi community as an example both of a style of designing computational device, but also as a way of thinking about designing for older people. We've also exhibited the piece, so it's appeared in New York MoMA. It's going to appear in the Museum of Media in Bradford in the UK and so forth. And it also got picked up by the press for reasons I may go into later, and sort of got covered by a number of newspapers and magazines and blogs and so forth. And this is fairly traditional. This is pretty standard for our work. This is a good example. We work with groups of people, we build things for them, we test them with people, and then we go out and try to reap the rewards of that work as a form of research, but also in slightly more endemic sort of design ways. Let me just step back before going on to say something about who we are. I run a place called the Interaction Research Studio. We're part of the design department at Goldsmiths, but we're a fairly self-contained entity with a beautiful studio space. There are about 12 staff researchers in the group. Drawn from a mixture of backgrounds, so a large number of us, or them, are from design and the art, and mainly design and some of the arts. We also have some people who are very strong in the social sciences, particularly sort of sociology and STS, and we have a number of people who are very competent in the technology world. So we're a fairly self-contained studio. I should point out these are not students, that everybody in the studio, and this is a list of their names, are staff researchers on contract, and many of them have been working in the studio for quite a long time, 5, even 10 years. So we're all kind of a professional research studio, and that, I think, makes a real difference in the kind of work that we can do. And it also means that I have to say that even though I'm the one talking, anything you see up here that you like is the product of everybody up here. And anything you don't like is probably me, which makes my job tough, but there you go. So what do we do? Well, we do research through design. That's what I tell people we do. And we do it very characteristically through designing and building highly finished prototypes, almost always of computational artifacts for everyday life, that is, life outside the workplace, and often for homes or various kinds of living arrangements rather than, say, for public spaces. So we have done that some. And so it's building things designing and building things is at the core of what we do, and then the other side of that is that we deploy them in field trials and let people try them so we understand what the things are, what they're about. As I said, most of the things are computational devices. These are a kind of portfolio of some of the things we've made ranging from the drift table the Geisha talked about to the local barometer on the bottom left, which shows text blown in through the home on the wind, or the plane tracker at the top right picks up airline transponder signals from passing aircraft and recreates their journeys using a hacked version of Google Earth and their prayer companion and so on. So we build these devices, we test them out in people's homes. The kind of thing I really want to explore in the rest of this talk, though, is not, I'd love to show you all these projects, but what I really want to do, for better or worse, is stand back and talk about, again, my understanding of what all this is about. How do these kinds of design projects serve as research? How do we transform them into research? How do we explain ourselves in collaboration with other people from different backgrounds? How do we make this stuff fly at places like the CHI conference? And even more deeply, and I think this is the root of it all, what the methodology is behind the methods that we use in our research. And I'm going to do this really by talking about our work in contrast with the sciences. So the reason I do this is because actually I have a scientific background. My PhD is in experimental psychology and cognitive science, so I was a PhD student for years in San Diego running experiments and doing all the things that experimental psychologists do. And so my understanding of what I'm doing now is very much by contrast with what I was doing then. So for example, in those days, my PhD thesis was developing a theory of everyday listening, of the ability people would have to hear events in the world by listening to the sounds those events make. It was a kind of extrapolation of J.J. Gibson's ecological theory of psychology, which I'm sure you're all very familiar with. And one of the key points was to do an experimental program in which I tried to investigate how people could hear the length and material of wood and metal bars based on the sounds they made. I'm not going to tell you much about it, just to point out that the style of work is one of working up theories about the physics of vibrating materials, including all the formulas for describing their vibrations, doing empirical research in which I asked people to make judgments about the materials, recorded the judgments, drew graphs, did statistical analyses, did post-processing on various of the sounds and tuned models and so forth and so on. And that was the style of research I did then, which I think contrasts quite a bit with the style of research that produced the Prayer Companion. Now, in trying to understand that, I'm going to take these as more or less reasonable representatives of doing science and doing design. My current take is that the way that I like to understand the differences between the two is in terms of the kind of accountability they have in talking with colleagues about what the work is about. And accountability sort of means two things. One is it's the basis on which one forms accounts or stories of your work, and on the other hand, it's the way one is asked to and takes responsibility for the work one is doing. So one may be held to account for one's work in characteristic ways. And I think the forms of accountability in science and design are characteristically different in a way that's really revealing for their methods. So in the sciences, I argue, the typical question I would receive about the kind of work I was doing was, how do I know what I'm saying is true? How do I know there's a logical chain leading from a theory of psychology through to a study of vibrating bars, through to an experimental situation and a bunch of analyses? And that kind of question kind of underpins most of the sort of critiquing questions that I would get while working as a scientist. As a designer, I think the kinds of accountability within a kind of native design context are very different. So I don't think it's about how you know what's true, but it's about how you know that what you're doing is working, or whether indeed the thing that you're making is working. And that can be true right the way from methodologies through to the things one produces. And I characterize this in terms of a kind of aesthetic accountability, where I mean as aesthetics, a kind of holistic pattern of working. It is tempting, not always correct, to say that these forms of accountability are the outcome of the basic questions of the two domains, so that science is typically concerned with characterizing the world as it is, whereas design is typically trying to wonder and produce a world as it might be. I think that this is a kind of correlation rather than a necessary connection, but it's a vaguely useful one. What I'd suggest is that the two kinds of accountability, these two kinds of ways of thinking about what the endeavor is about, leads to different logic for the research being done in the two fields. So within science, the typical kind of scientific method, as it were, leads from a body of theory towards a kind of metacognitive realization that the theory may lead to implications that haven't been checked or that might be in question, which leads to hypotheses for tests, to the operationalization of those hypotheses in terms of experiments, and then the analysis of the resulting data to try to fold them back into the theory. Sometimes things go the other way around. Sometimes theory can make certain observations seem interesting and worth trying to generalize in the form of hypotheses or statements to add to a theory, but we need not be too concerned about that right now. In design, I think the cycle is very different. So the way I see design is that there is a world, including the artifacts in that world, that designer's job is to invent new possibilities for design, which take the form of proposals for possible designs or a design space for exploration. That some of those proposals would be refined in the form of what I call prototypes, that is, sort of untested new designs, and then it's through assessment of those prototypes that they take their place into the wider world of artifacts. And so the world that design is designing for is changing. Design is not studying a world that's in some sense stable the way perhaps science is, but rather it's creating a world and creating into that changing world. These kinds of cycles, these kinds of logics, these kinds of processes lead to different values for the two domains, so that within science, with its kind of emphasis on discovering truths, the kinds of values that are important are things, fairly well-known things like objectivity, replicability, generalizability, causality, production of causal explanations, and so forth. Within design, I think the core values of design, and I'm being a little muddy about research of design, are fairly different. So on the left, I'm showing some of the kind of basic values of what it means to do a good job designing, that your design should be functional in the sense of working and providing a function in some sense, not necessarily technical, that they're aesthetically controlled, that their aesthetics are controlled with respect to the situation of use, and that ideally they're engaging in some ways, that people will engage with them in ways that one feels one has been aiming for. There's another set of values that I think are particularly important for kind of great design or design to be used as research, which is design. Good design, I think, has an individuality. It has a resonance with the world. It speaks not only to its situation, but kind of resonates out into a larger view of the world. That it tells a narrative in the sense that a design will, in a sense, imply a story, have logical, have consequences or ramifications for other areas and other futures, and because of that can be evocative. That is, a great design can lead to ideas about other great designs that are kind of implied by that. These are really different values, and I am not going to quibble over any of these words. I am trying to point in a direction, but these are very different values. What the values of science, all this stress on replicability and so forth, is a way of allowing us to say what exists in the world with some certainty. It leads to a kind of rigor about the kinds of descriptions of the world we produce. What the values of design leads to is a different kind of rigor. It's nonetheless rigorous. It is nonetheless rigorous, but it is not a rigor that works in the same way that scientific rigor does. Scientific rigor is something like logic-based or rule-based. It's based on accountability and clarity and an ability to form logic that one can defend every step of the way. I think that design rigor is based on a kind of intersubjective agreement about the value of design. And by that I mean design rigor comes from a design community, not a set of rules. So that's why I believe that communities like this one are crucial in making sure that good quality design and design research happens. It depends on the intersubjectivity of a community, not a set of rule-based methods. So all of this, if you buy any of this so far, I think this leads to two basic ways to understand possibilities for doing research through design. One is science-led, and it basically slots design into a basic scientific logic. And the notion is here that we open up this kind of circle from theory to hypothesis to data to allow design to, in a sense, be the way that hypotheses are tested and data is produced. So from once you have a set of hypotheses, but they may be known as research questions or objectives or so forth, one can go into a design cycle, produce designs, and those designs and the ways they may be evaluated take the form of data that then can be analyzed and used to produce theories. There's kind of two payoffs from this kind of endeavor, I believe. One is the actual data produced, the whole account of what happens when people try designs that have been created to test a series of questions or to explore a series of attributes. And the other sort of big payoff for this version of research through design is in the possibilities that allows for us to build theories of design, sort of theoretical accounts of how design works and how it ought to work. I think there's another model of design which I characterize as design-led, which basically starts with the design cycle I've discussed earlier and doesn't do much to it. It says the design cycle as used in producing design already itself can be the basis of a powerful form of research. And the payoffs of this kind of design, if used well, is to create several things. One is in the process of creating proposals and developing design. In the process of creating proposals, exploring possibilities for design, we can create design spaces of possibility for design that themselves are research payoffs. We can create a thing, which is possibly the most important payoff from research through design, the kind of ultimate particular referred to by Eric Stolterman that embodies a great number of ideas and hypotheses. And we can gather stories of meaning, I'll say loosely, which might involve both accounts of how people actually live with and use the things we design, but also might include things like expert critique and the sorts of narratives that designs engender. I would suggest that all of these are first-class payoffs of research through design that really ought to be valued as highly as any output of scientific methods. Now, there's a couple of tricks, I think, to actually doing design as research, which allows it to pay off in these ways. And the first one is simply that the topics for design. This is the most ugly slide I've ever made in my life. Well, actually, it's not, but it's the most ugly slide I've ever shown publicly. And I'm not going to apologize. I'm kind of proud in a perverse way. All right, so anyway, but the point is, in order for all this to pay off as research, I believe one of the key points is in choosing the topic or the situation or the context for design. That often in trying to do design in order to provide research payoffs within a community within a research community, a large part of the trick, as it were, is in choosing a topic or often a situation for design wisely. And the second trick I'll tell you in a minute. So if you buy this at all, this is my account of what I think I'm doing when I do research through design, then the methods, this is where the approach is simple. The methods, in a sense, flow out naturally. So the basic point is that the methods we use in doing this kind of research need to be appropriate for this kind of endeavor, not for a scientific endeavor. And I think when I say the approach is simple, what I mean is that I look at this as a kind of methodology for design research, a kind of underlying philosophy or set of beliefs about how to go about doing research and design. The methodology is really simple. It basically says, do design and understand the context or the situation in which you're doing it and how to map it to other research areas. The methods can be as complex as you want them to be, but the wellspring, the basic approach to design is very simple. So let me talk about some of those methods. And we've already heard about a few, unfortunately. But I tend to talk about these things in terms of a kind of trajectory of research or design that is pretty bog standard. It sort of relates to the cycle I showed you earlier. It is not really significantly different from very many others of these sorts of models, and it's also pretty fictional. But it talks about design as going from an exploration of a context to us making proposals to set up a design space, developing proposals, and evaluating and drawing conclusions from those proposals. The reason I'm not going to push this too much is that in practice I think it's important to recognize and respect the fact that it's always messier than that. In the middle of a project, things may wrap around, they may get confused, things you thought were prototypes actually might end up being proposals and so forth. Things will come in from outside, things will disappear. It's a mess. But this gives us a kind of fictional way to structure our understanding of the process that can be useful in talking about it afterwards and in the doing of design. So we have various methods that we've explored for doing all these different things. One of the points about exploring context is that, I'm sure this is not unfamiliar to anybody, that we draw on any number of different perspectives and approaches in trying to explore particular areas of interest. So this is kind of a general slide, but for instance, in trying to work with the nuns, we not only talked to, no, actually I'll go to that later, but we used a variety of different ways to do that. And it's to make a strong statement, the kind of theories we read or academic work we read about various contexts are no more and no less important to us than things like artworks that are in the domain or strange niche publications or things from the popular press, little news articles and so forth. They all are kind of grist for the mill and trying to get a feel for the context in which we're working. We've also, that is the same spirit which informed the cultural probes, which we did years ago. We originally did years ago and kind of advanced in various ways since. So cultural probes, for anybody who hasn't heard about this stuff, are basically their kind of canonical form is kits of evocative tasks that we use to inspire responses from people that we work with. And the task, there's usually multiple tasks. They might be anything from a camera asking for various pictures around the house of things like the spiritual center of your home or something red or something at 4 o'clock on a Tuesday, all of which is meant to get people pointing the camera in strange directions that they might include on the middle, on the far left, a map on which to diagram friends and family, which is a kind of traditional sociological technique that we give graphical diagrams to mess up the process and to make it less obvious. In this case, a picture of Dante's Heaven and Hell, in which you're to map your friends and family, which is kind of good. Or the piece on the little red device on the top towards the right is a dream recorder. It's a repackaged digital memo taker with the instructions to pull a tab when you wake up from a vivid dream, at which point you have 10 seconds to tell us about the dream, after which the device shuts down and you can either return it or throw it away, which led me to believe in psychoanalysis all over again. And so what we get out of this kind of thing is a mess. It's a mess of writing and pictures and drawings and scribbled notes. It's different from every household. People respond to these things different ways. And they're all designed to do that. The tasks are usually designed to be either very open-ended or slightly confusing in order to make people struggle to tell us about themselves using these materials. And the results come back as fragmentary, as confusing, as obscure, and they make us struggle to try to make meaning out of them, and they remind us that all our meanings are always provisional and never really settled, that we don't really know what's going on, but we have some clues. And that is, to me, it's an anti-scientific method that's been very productive for our design. I have to say that, as Geshe said, cultural probes have been around for a while. It's like everybody does cultural probes, and within our group, we're all getting a bit sick of them too. So we've been messing around with the methods a bit. One of the things we did recently was to work with a children's book illustrator and writer to produce what we called a storybook probe, which was basically an illustrated book left incomplete, kind of left partially complete throughout, which starts off with the trope that you wake up one day and discover that you've been shrunk to the size of a pea and are now exploring your home. And it leads through various scenarios in the home and asks people to fill them out, which people did in a really amazing variety of ways, involving anything from detailed drawings to photographs to stories to little philosophical vignettes. And that's just one of the ways that we kind of take on the spirit of the probes without, again, producing a package of materials, et cetera, et cetera. Now, part of what I'm trying to paint here is, on the one hand, a way of understanding context that's really experimental, but actually I think the real point is that it's a way of understanding context that doesn't answer to epistemological accountability of the sciences. We're not trying to get a kind of sociological account of the home or whatever domain we're working for. We're trying to get accounts and insights and fragments and leads into the context that will allow us to do our design work. So with the nuns, for instance, we didn't do any of this stuff. We actually just went and talked to them a lot. We spent a lot of time up in the monastery discussing with them how they live, what they care about. They were not semi-structured interviews. They were not structured at all, really. They were just conversations. And from that, we felt that we developed over time a fair understanding of what the nuns were about. We supplemented that by looking at a lot of information about Poor Clares as a kind of as a form of Catholicism, reading about nuns in a variety of fictional and documentary works and so forth. But again, the real core message here is that what we're after in all this is, to use a very old slogan of ours, inspiration, not information. We don't want full accounts of the people we're working for other situations. What we're looking for is things that will inspire designs. From working on context, we work towards trying to invent or trying to explore a possible landscapes of designs, which we typically do by developing sketch proposals and all the things that everybody does, but usually gathering them together at various points to form what we call design workbooks, which may not be used widely, in which we try to collect large numbers of proposals, but also collect brief descriptions of other work that serve in the same role as proposals to try to paint out possibilities for design. The thing about our workbooks, which are important to us but sometimes confusing to collaborators, is that they tend to be very minimal. They tend to use only a few pictures and a little bit of text. They're not scenarios, they're not walkthroughs of design ideas, they're not detailed, they don't have much technology in them, they're pointers towards spaces for design. And then because of that, they're very open and mutable, so we can all look at them and imagine ways that the things that are on the page could be taken forward or changed or turned around. And it's that openness and minimalism that allows them to be productive for design. In the case of the nuns, we actually kind of hit upon a point of design fairly early on in the project when, in discussing what we might do with them, one of us asked, how did the nuns know what to pray for? And that became a key question for us. So we knew that they listened to the radio some, they had access to world news through Catholic publications, they had letters and requests for prayer, emails with other nuns from around the world and so forth. But we worried that there might be sort of a media bias in their exposure to the world, that the access they had to the world was channeled and filtered in ways that we might be able to open slightly through a design. And that led us on the general path of producing the prayer companion. The workbook we produced then was really focused around the notion of providing this kind of information. And we produced a workbook which basically focused on how this might happen rather than what. So we showed, furniture with text-like displays, or we showed little devices that might be hung in their outdoor spaces, audio displays, things for their dining room, and a large notice board with text all over it that might be in their common room. We took it up to the monastery and showed it to the nuns we were working with, And their reaction was initially one of kind of utter amazement, largely that technology could do any of these things, which was kind of cool. But then followed very quickly by real understanding and appreciation for what it was we were trying to accomplish with these things, followed then by real worries about the potential intrusiveness and distraction of having these kind of technologies within the monastery. They made it very clear that they are in the monastery to withdraw from kind of the noise of everyday life, and anything that distracted from their purpose would be summarily kicked out again. They would not live with anything they didn't like. So that meant that as we started to refine the piece, we really focused in on how to make it acceptable within the actual situation of the monastery. As any designer knows, there's about 1,000 decisions that go from an initial design idea to actually producing the piece, and these work on all kinds of different aspects, and it's no different. Simultaneously, it's really no different for us. So in producing the prayer companion, we explored existing artifacts within sort of Catholic traditions, such as the variety of chalices in the Victorian Albert Museum, various crosses, statues, and so forth, to try to get a feel for the form and the shape and the appearance of these kind of artifacts. We produced innumerable drawings, sketches, computer renderings, and finally computer models of what the device might look like to try to get a feel for the appropriate form. And I cannot tell you how many there were floating around the studio before finally deciding on the form that seemed to work best. Meanwhile, we were working on the technology, trying to understand how to make the text flow in a way that would be aesthetically appealing and appropriate, and how to indeed to make the thing work at all. And in the end, we formed the device on a rapid prototyping machine, which at the time was new to us and is becoming very standard for our practice, and finished it to produce the working artifact. Now I should say, just to clarify, that just to remind you that the thing draws content from the web. It uses RSS news feeds and also draws from a site called wefeelfine.org, which itself scrapes the web for things like Facebook or blogs or Flickr and so forth for sentences containing the words "I feel," and we scrape that to interject that within the flow of news information. The slide shows examples of some of the sentences that we retrieved using these kind of algorithms, and these are sentences that have actually appeared in the monastery, some of which are potentially you can see as prayer-worthy. So, I don't know, the UAE Sheikh acquitted in Tate beating, or McCann parents to attend libel case, and so forth, and some of which seem utterly irrelevant, particularly in the case of the I feel statements, which contain some things that you might imagine would evoke a prayer. So, I feel like a failure and everything, and some things that probably wouldn't, like I feel like tacos. And we don't filter any of these. We do not take it on ourselves to choose what is worthy for the nuns to pray for. We provide it all to them and allow them to decide, which is important, I think, to the design. Let me just finish by talking a little bit about how we assess our designs. My understanding these days is that there are sort of several levels of assessment, and one is really simply whether the design is at all a success, whether we can claim success at all, and this really depends on the trajectory of appreciation. So we give things to people to try for a long period of time because we typically find that when we give people something new to try, something they've never seen before, they're really enthusiastic, and they will tell us all the ways in which they think it's great, and that lasts for a few days. If we ended the trial then, we'd be in clover, but we don't. We keep going. What we find after that first enthusiasm is that almost always people are disappointed when they realize it's not quite as the thing they thought it was at first, and the appreciation goes down a bit. And then the real crucial thing is what happens after that. I mean, that first bit, that's pretty much normal. So what happens after that? In a number of our successful deployments, and really this is probably the majority of them, the Appreciation after that sort of goes up and down, but stays at a kind of medium pace for often a very long time. And our trials run from at least a month, but these days more to sort of 6 months or longer. We've had a few deployments, unfortunately, in which the designs follow the red line, in which after a kind of initial enthusiasm, the appreciation goes down and just keeps dropping until people stop engaging with the devices at all. And we've had now one recently which follows the yellow line, where there's just minimal sort of engagement with occasional blips of interest, which is sort of interestingly ambiguous for us. But this kind of basic appreciation is one way we understand whether whether people are engaging with our designs, is one way we understand whether the things are working. Much more interesting to us, assuming things are working at all, are other forms of assessing what the actual experience is. So we often use ethnographic techniques to explore what people do with our designs, and that can include anything from people in our studio hanging out within people's homes for days at a time, to more short-term interviews, and so forth. I should stress that we have a couple of trained ethnographers. This is not sort of ethnography light. These are people who are trained in the sociological ethnography, so they they do a great job at both making salient observations and being able to back them up with data, and often bringing the things together to kind of emergent thematic narratives in a way that at least draws in part on ethnomethodology. This is actually the closest we get to science, and I think that's interesting, because this is the point where we want to be able to say that the things that we're saying that people do with our devices are actually what they do with those devices. This is the point where we don't want ambiguity or unclarity. We want to be able to make that account, because that sort of swings back through the rest and helps understand what's happened in the rest of the project. But we also use more sort of design-led methods. And one of the things we've talked about using is cultural commentators, where the basic idea is that we get people from outside research and outside design and outside our studio to comment on the participants' experience with the things we've made from their own kind of professional backgrounds. So, for instance, this is a news article that appeared about the prayer companion in the monastery. That was written by the editor of a Catholic periodical, basically because we asked her to write the article. And we asked her to write the article not just because we wanted everybody to hear about our device, but because we were really interested in hearing what another Catholic, how she would interpret the device within the monastery. It was not, in the end, super thrilling. She liked it and thought it was interesting. But it was good that she thought that. I mean, it could have gone very badly wrong. And that would have been even more interesting. The other thing we've done a lot is to hire documentary filmmakers to come in and do documentary films about the pieces in people's homes. And the trick there is that even though we pay them to make the documentaries, which obviously will bias them in some ways, we explicitly say that their job is not to make a promotional piece, but to make a documentary of what they're finding. And often we will not tell them about the device or tell them about the system that we've made, but ask them to just go to the participants and let them explain it themselves. And those can be quite powerful in letting us see the things we've made through other people's eyes. The third thing we've done recently is, in a recent project, we hired a poet to go in and look at some of the things we made and actually write poems about the pieces, which we did this twice, and the first one is immensely informative. That's not the right word. It draws out the experience in ways that I had not anticipated, not always happy ways. The other one is simply opaque and makes so many literary references I have no idea what she's talking about. But that's another way. Now, the point of all this is not to set these people up as experts so much as to draw more voices into trying to reveal the kinds of experiences people are having with our systems. So the notion is to try to put together a kind of polyphonic assessment, a multi-voiced assessment of the things and how they work and how they live. So again, not to try to get at a single unitary truth, but to open up a space of interpretations. So that's what we do. Those are our methods. Let me just finish by saying a few things about what I think we know when we're done with all this, because again, this is all meant to be research, it's not just meant to be fun. And I think the point is that in a scientific sense, this kind of way of working really doesn't, there's not much you conclude very firmly from it. It's very hard with this kind of method to imagine replicating this, either the design process or the coming up with the same designs. It's not even clear that having a prayer companion, you would replicate the experience if you went to other monasteries or other kinds of people. They're not particularly, because of this in part, it's hard to know how to generalize some of our findings in any kind of firm or sort of scientific way, and equally it's difficult to theorize this work, though not impossible, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Instead, I think what I value our work for is as a kind of existence proof of a state of affairs that we've created through our design. So again, what we make is a kind of ultimate particular, a thing that exists that never existed before, and in itself that is a value within both design and research. More than that, things kind of embody massive numbers of understanding the world, sort of theories about people, what they value, how they work, what they care about, and so forth. And particularly deploying things with participants allows us to both draw out those theories and extend them in seeing how actually people use our devices. So there's a kind of truth to be had in our process, but it's a truth really bound to the particularity of the exact deployment and exact devices we've made. And I think that's allows design research to be criticized from scientific points of view, but it's actually the strength and the kind of endemic strength of doing research as a designer. One of the ways we've talked about bringing this out, and this is actually the second trick that I was going to talk about in terms of making design into research, is through the ways we annotate the things that we've made. And I choose the term annotation because it sort of points to a special property or special features of the ways that we talk about our research. And by annotation, I mean simply sort of presenting both the thing, the artifact, or the process, or the field studies with some kind of usually textual, word-based, description of what's happened. And the point about this, though, is that the words and the thing are held very closely together. So annotations point out aspects of the artifact or the design that might not otherwise be immediately obvious in looking at the artifact itself, and that thus help to point out what's important about it, what the designer cares about, what the features are that matter. And this is crucial, but they don't divorce themselves from the artifact. They're not sort of theoretical statements that live away from the artifact itself. Rather, they have a dyadic relationship with the artifact. They point to the artifact, and the artifact fleshes out what the words might mean. And in this way, the annotations become bridges to different research communities. So annotations, the descriptions we make of our designs, is the way we draw out the features of those designs in ways that are relevant and topical and sort of applicable to the research communities to whom we talk. And I think that's very important. I think it goes beyond annotation of individual objects as well. So lately we've been talking about what happens when you annotate portfolios of designs. So if we start to try to talk about a number of designs at once, the way that annotations can still keep this very tight relationship with the artifacts, while in a sense setting up dimensions which can be occupied by multiple artifacts. But we need not go into detail now. So that's what I have to say. I'm sorry it has been sort of pseudo-theoretical or meta-theoretical, but that's what I'm interested in talking about right now. And again, there's kind of basic points I wanted to make today. And the first is simply that I think it's important to recognize that there are characteristic differences between the forms of accountability and the kinds of questions asked when one is doing science versus design. That designers should kind of respect and own and value the kinds of questions that design tends to ask and can ask well. I think that our methods need to, you like this one, don't you? Our methods really need to reflect the purpose and the kind of forms of accountability that we want to take on for design, and that rather than seeing design as a kind of tail or mutant hybrid with science, we need to value design as a form of inquiry in its own right and learn how to articulate both the workings and the outputs and the forms of forms of accountability that are native to design. And finally, one of the ways forwards in doing this, I think, is to understand the role of annotation and pointing out all of the factors of design that make it a valuable research endeavor. And that's me. Thank you.